Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dorklords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segment. And it's time for part 2 of my latest mini-topic series. Put out a call for topics that wouldn't require an entire video. And I got so many awesome responses that I split up the answers into multiple videos. Part 1's already out. You can find it on the channel. This is part 2. And since I got more mini topics during part 1, there's going to be a part 3 as well. So sit back and enjoy mini topics part 2. First off, a quick Rings of Power note. In my Comic-Con trailer recap, I chatted about the mark left on the anvil in the abandoned northern fortress, wondering if perhaps it was a version of Morgoth's crown. From a clip that came out on Stephen Colbert's show, we're told this mark is definitely associated with Sauron. And keen-eyed commenter, Kieran, alliteration there, made an observation that I had missed. One of the first costume images that was released was the character we later learned to be Theo, holding a broken black sword. He's holding it in the trailer as well. That image, which I'll show here, clearly shows that the sword also has Sauron's mark on it. It makes sense. The old man in the trailer mentions Sauron to Theo. But here is a concrete symbol marking this as likely an early form of Morgul blade. A few folks, including Fellowship of Fans, have also noted that if you turn the symbol sideways, strongly resembles the mountains framing Mordor. I'm not 100% sure that's intentional, but assuming it is, I suppose it's showing that Sauron's mark is branded on Middle-earth itself, obviously indicating his base of power. We'll find out soon enough. Rings of Power drops on September 2nd. By the way, my wife Jackie gave me a couple of awesome Tolkien-themed gifts for our anniversary. One of them is this guy. The King of the Oathbreakers, the Men of Dunharrow. An excellent addition to my Lord of the Rings Funko Pop collection. And let's keep in mind, when did the Oathbreakers break their oath? The Second Age. We may well see this guy in the Rings of Power series, though probably in later seasons. All right, farewell you. I'll show the other gift at the end of the video. Now, on to a question from Jason Meekins. And Jason asks, is there any chance that after the War of Wrath, that when Finarfin was here with the host of the West, did he and Galadriel get to see each other even for a moment? I'll hazard a guess there's no actual mention, so just speculation. This is a question I've asked myself, Jason, and you're right, there's no actual mention, so let's speculate. First, to catch everyone up on what Jason's referring to, back during the years of the trees, so before the First Age, before the sun and moon had risen, Galadriel and her brothers joined the large group of Noldor elves who left Aman against the wishes of the Valar and headed to Middle-earth. Her father, Finarfin, stayed behind. He received a pardon from the Valar and became the ruler of the Noldor elves that stayed in Aman. So this was a huge moment in the relationship between Finarfin and his children. I'd have to think he expected his kids to join him when he turned back. But nope, they stayed the course. And they were also leaving their mother, Eärwen, who was a Teleri elf and so was not part of the Noldor journey east. So there's a separation. And hundreds of years pass until, as Jason mentioned, the War of Wrath occurs, which ends the First Age. The Valar send troops, and this is where Finarfin finally heads east. We get this quote from the Silmarillion. But the host of the Valar prepared for battle, and beneath their white banners marched the Vanyar, the people of Ingwe, and also those of the Noldor who never departed from Valinor, whose leader was Finarfin, the son of Finwë. So, Finarfin is now on the same continent as his one surviving child at that point, Galadriel. Finrod gets reborn. We'll talk about that in a second. And the War of Wrath takes over 40 years. So there's time for father and daughter to meet, if that's in the cards. What makes this tricky is that Galadriel is not fighting in the War of Wrath. She'll likely be fighting in that war in the Rings of Power, and in fact her relationship with her father might come up in that series. But in the books, she and Celeborn pass over the mountains into Eriador long before the War of Wrath. We get this quote from the Mirror of Galadriel chapter in the Fellowship of the Ring. "For the Lord of the Galathrim, Celeborn, is accounted the wisest of the elves of Middle-earth, and a giver of gifts beyond the power of kings. He has dwelt in the west since the days of dawn, and I have dwelt with him years uncounted. For ere the fall of Nargothrond or Gondolin, I passed over the mountains, and together, through ages of the world, we have fought the long defeat." The key there is that she mentions passing over the mountains before the fall of Nargothrond or Gondolin, both of which occurred before the War of Wrath. So, even though Finarfin is in Middle-earth, he's still separated from Galadriel by several miles, a war, and a mountain range. Hence, the easy answer would be no, they probably didn't meet up. But hang on, I think there's a reasonable scenario for their reunion. I doubt they met during the war. However, the war ends in 587 of the First Age, but the host of the West doesn't leave until 590. It's during that 3-year window that this might have come off. First, we get this quote from Unfinished Tales about Galadriel at the end of the First Age. "Pride still moved her, Galadriel, when, at the end of the Elder Days, after the final overthrow of Morgoth, she refused the pardon of the Valar for all who had fought against him, and remained in Middle-earth." So after the War of Wrath, most of the Noldor accepted the pardon of the Valar and returned to the west. Galadriel, obviously, stayed in Middle-earth through the end of the Third Age and the War of the Ring. The quote says she refused the pardon of the Valar. I'm wondering how she knew about the pardon. If she was over the mountains at the time, who would have told her? I think it's possible that she was sent for by Eonwe, leader of the host of Valinor, and perhaps she refused the pardon in person. If that's the case, Galadriel would have been in very close proximity to her father, and they likely would have met. Though, assuming that meeting took place, it means Galadriel chose once again not to join her father in his return to the west. There's some talk that perhaps Finarfin visited his son Finrod's grave. And if so, perhaps he visited that grave with Galadriel. Here's a quote regarding Finrod's burial after he was killed by one of Sauron's werewolves. "They buried the body of Felagund, Finrod, upon the hilltop of his own isle, and it was clean again. And the green grave of Finrod, Finarfin's son, fairest of all the princes of the elves, remained inviolate until the land was changed and broken, and foundered under destroying seas. But Finrod walks with Finarfin his father beneath the trees in Eldamar." So Finrod was buried near the tower he had built, the original Minas Tirith, which had become Sauron's Isle of Werewolves. Love the name. And we see that he was eventually reborn and reunited with his father in the west. So I could see Finarfin seeking out his son's resting place during the War of Wrath. He would have likely had the opportunity in between battles, and he would have had the proximity to the gravesite. But note, that quote mentions that Finrod's grave remained inviolate until the land was changed and broken. Well, the land was broken as a result of the final battle of the War of Wrath. So I think that by the time Galadriel might have conceivably met with her father at the end of the War of Wrath, Finrod's grave would have been underwater. And thus ends my speculation. So I hope that answers your question, Jason. Many thanks for the topic. The next question comes from Jacket Jack, who asks, "Seeing as how the elves who awoke in Cuiviénen made up their own language, what exactly did the Valar speak when communicating with each other?" Thanks for the question, Jack. As you say, the elves that went to the west brought their own language, Quenya, with them. Here's the quote from the Silmarillion regarding the awakening of the elves at Cuiviénen. Long they dwelt in their first home by the water under stars, and they walked the earth in wonder. And they began to make speech and to give names to all things that they perceived. Themselves they named the Quendi, signifying those that speak with voices. For as yet they had met no other living things that spoke or sang. So I think your question is, what language were the Valar speaking before the elves arrived? It would be a big coincidence if it happened to be Elvish. And I think Tolkien changed his mind on the answer to this question over time. I think the very first language of the Valar would have been the sounds that created the world, the music of the Ainur. This is a description of that music from the Silmarillion. Then the voices of the Ainur, like unto harps and lutes, and pipes and trumpets, and viols and organs, and like unto countless choirs singing with words, began to fashion the theme of Iluvatar to a great music. And a sound arose of endless interchanging melodies, woven in harmony that passed beyond hearing, into the depths and into the heights, and the places of the dwelling of Iluvatar were filled to overflowing, and the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. So Tolkien even describes the music as like unto countless choirs singing with words. Hence, the music was a language, a way to communicate through sound. But in a letter Tolkien wrote, we see that he thought of the Valar as beings that had transcended the need for language. Since the Valar had no language of their own, not needing one, they had no true names, only identities, and their names were conferred on them by the elves, being in origin, therefore, all, as it were, nicknames, referring to some striking peculiarity, function, or deed. In consequence, each identity had several nicknames, and the names of the Valar were not necessarily related in different Elvish languages. So it seems pretty clear that at the time of that letter, 1958, Tolkien assumed the Valar didn't have a language. That changed, however, and in the 11th volume of the History of Middle-earth, The War of the Jewels, we get Tolkien's notes on Valorin, the language of the Valar. And as Tolkien does so brilliantly, he writes from the point of view of Pengaloth, a great Elvish lore master. Little is said in Noldoran lore, such has been preserved, concerning the language of the Valar and Maiar. Even if we had no knowledge of it, Pengaloth says, we could not reasonably doubt that the Valar had a Lambe, language, of their own. We know that all members of their order were incarnated by their own desire, and that most of them chose to take forms like those of the children of Eru, as they name us. In such forms, they would take on all the characteristics of the incarnates, for otherwise the assumption of these forms would have been needless, and they arrayed themselves in this manner long before they had any cause to appear before us visibly. Since then, the making of a Lambe is the chief character of an incarnate, the Valar, having arrayed them in this manner, would inevitably, during their long sojourn in Arda, have made a Lambe for themselves. But without argument, we know that they did so, for there are references to the Lambe Valarinwa in old lore and histories, though these are few and scattered. Few of the Eldar ever learned to speak Valarin, even haltingly. Among the people as a whole, only a small number of words or names became widely known. Feanor, indeed, before the growth of his discontent, is said to have learned more of this tongue than any others before his time, and his knowledge must at any rate have far surpassed the little that is now recorded. But what he knew, he kept to himself, and he refused to transmit it because of his quarrel with the Valar. Well, that pretty much tracks for Feanor, right? Brilliant. Not a guy you want to have dinner with. More about him later in this video. So, he was one of the few elves to learn Valarin. And the reasoning given for the Valar adopting a language is that when they took incarnate forms, language was part of that adaptation. Hence, Valarin. That passage goes on to give us at least one elvish term that apparently derives from Valarin.
Mahanaxar.
The Ring of Doom. Not that ring. This is the hall where the Valar would hold court. So there is some effect of Valarin on the elvish language. Jacket Jack, I hope that answers your question. The next question comes from Eris Gazetus, and Eris writes, I always wondered why the Mouth of Sauron refers to his master as Sauron, as opposed to Myron the Great. Surely Sauron would not call himself abhorred, aka Sauron. I like this question because you're right. Sauron means the abhorred. And it seems odd that one of his chief lieutenants would use that name. But just to have it on record, here's the quote from The Return of the King. The lieutenant of the Tower of Barad-dûr he was, and his name is remembered in no tale, for he himself had forgotten it. And he said, I am the Mouth of Sauron. But it is told that he was a renegade, who came of the race of those who are named the Black Númenóreans, for they established their dwellings in Middle-earth during the years of Sauron's domination, and they worshipped him, being enamored of evil knowledge. So, said the messenger, then thou art the spokesman, old greybeard? Have we not heard of thee at whiles and of thy wanderings, ever hatching plots and mischief at a safe distance? But this time thou hast stuck out thy nose too far, Master Gandalf, and thou shalt see what comes to him who sets his foolish webs before the feet of Sauron the Great. So you might think, well, the name started as an insult, but over time it just stuck and became an accepted name. Kind of reminds me of the Doors of Moria, which are a symbol of peace, obviously, between the dwarves and elves, and yet the word Moria is carved in the door. Moria is a derogatory term coined by the elves meaning black pit. But maybe the dwarves embraced it as some kind of badge of honor. So that's one possible explanation. The name became less offensive over time. Except, we get this quote from Aragorn in The Two Towers. Upon their shields they bore a strange device, a small white hand in the center of a black field. On the front of their iron helms was set an S rune, wrought of some white metal. I have not seen these tokens before, said Aragorn. What do they mean? S is for Sauron, said Gimli. That is easy to read. Nay, said Legolas, Sauron does not use the elf runes. Neither does he use his right name, nor permit it to be spelt or spoken, said Aragorn. And he does not use white. The orcs in the service of Barad-dûr use the sign of the red eye. He stood for a moment in thought. S is for Saruman, I guess, he said at length. So, there we see that, according to Aragorn, Sauron doesn't permit his followers to call him the Abhorred. I'm not sure what the answer is. I suppose Tolkien could have slipped up and used Sauron's name without thinking of who was saying it. But that seems unlikely, given his obsessive attention to detail. So I'm going to go with this theory. The Mouth of Sauron is the title of the individual charged with parleying with the enemy. He calls him Sauron the Great. He's using the language of the enemy in his meeting. They know his master as Sauron, so he uses that name in front of them. But should he ever be in the same room with Sauron, it's likely the last word he'd ever use. Or maybe Tolkien slipped up. Anyway, I hope that answers your question, Eris. The next question comes from Napdragon, who asked me to compare the elven characters from the Silmarillion, Cyros and Dairon. It's a great question, Napdragon. I hadn't thought of the parallels between these two characters until you brought it up, so many thanks. All right, Cyros and Dairon are both, for lack of a better term, jerks, who become central obstacles for the human heroes Beren and Turin. I'd call them foils. Dairon is a foil for Beren, and Cyros is a foil for Turin. Both Cyros and Dairon lived in Doriath under King Thingol in the First Age. And as it happens, they may have even been related. We get this quote from one of the footnotes in Unfinished Tales. In one variant text of this section of the narrative, Cyros is said to have been the kinsman of Dairon, and in another, Dairon's brother. The text printed is probably the latest. So Tolkien at least considered making these two characters brothers. That's how alike he thought of them. Let's start with Dairon and his involvement in the Beren and Luthien tale. Let me say first of all that Dairon actually has quite a few positive traits. First, we're told in the Silmarillion that Dairon became the greatest of all the minstrels of the elves east of the sea, named even before Maglor, son of Feanor. So Dairon is the best elven musician in Middle-earth during the First Age. And he's a Sindar elf. He's never been to the west, but he's still more skilled than the Noldor elves such as Maglor. So high praise for Dairon. Second, when Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, calls for the Merith Arathod, the Feast of Reuniting, King Thingol isn't excited about the prospect of unification with the Noldor, but he feels an obligation to honor Fingolfin's request. So he sends 2 emissaries to represent Doriath at this auspicious festival, Mablung and Dairon. So we see that Thingol holds Dairon in some esteem. And third, Dairon created his own alphabet. There's a reference to it in the appendices, but this quote comes from the Silmarillion. Of the long years of peace that followed after the coming of Denethor, there is little tale. In those days, it is said, Dairon the minstrel, chief lore master of the kingdom of Thingol, devised his runes, and the Naugrim that came to Thingol learned them, and were well pleased with the device, esteeming Dairon's skill higher than did the Sindar, his own people. By the Naugrim, the Cirth were taken east over the mountains and passed into the knowledge of many peoples, but they were little used by the Sindar for the keeping of records, until the days of the war, and much that was held in memory perished in the ruins of Doriath. So Dairon created an alphabet that the dwarves ended up using, but his own people, the elves of Doriath, didn't. As the quote says, the dwarves esteemed Dairon's skill higher than did the Sindar, his own people. This could be a cause shaping Dairon's personality. He probably feels that those around him, like Luthien, don't recognize, and should recognize, his own greatness. Beren and Luthien have a secret courtship. He's human, she's half-elf, half-Maya, so the relationship would be strongly discouraged. Enter Dairon. But Dairon the minstrel also loved Luthien, and he espied her meetings with Beren, and betrayed them to Thingol. Then the king was filled with anger, for Luthien he loved above all things, setting her above all the princes of the elves, whereas mortal men he did not even take into his service. So Dairon betrays Luthien, because he loves her, and is jealous of the fact that she loves a human over him. That initiates the quest for a Silmaril. Thingol tells Beren that if he wants to marry Luthien, he must bring Thingol a Silmaril from Morgoth's crown. And here is Beren's response. But Beren laughed. For little price, he said, do elven kings sell their daughters, for gems and things made by craft. But if this be your will, Thingol, I will perform it. And when we meet again, my hand shall hold a Silmaril from the Iron Crown. For you have not looked the last upon Beren, son of Barahir. Then he looked in the eyes of Melian, who spoke not, and he bade farewell to Luthien Tenuviel. And bowing before Thingol and Melian, he put aside the guards about him, and departed from Menegroth alone. Love that passage. Note that Dairon's betrayal leads to Beren leaving Doriath, sending him out into the world outside that protective girdle of Melian. Dairon also betrays Luthien a second time. She obviously didn't realize he'd betrayed her the first time, so when Beren gets captured, she unfortunately goes to Dairon for help. In the time when Sauron cast Beren into the pit, a weight of horror came upon Luthien's heart, and going to Melian for counsel, she learned that Beren lay in the dungeons of Tol in Galroth, without hope of rescue. Then Luthien, perceiving that no help would come from any other on earth, resolved to fly from Doriath and come herself to him. But she sought the aid of Dairon, and he betrayed her purpose to the king. Then Thingol was filled with fear and wonder, and because he would not deprive Luthien of the lights of heaven, lest she fail and fade, and yet would restrain her, he caused a house to be built from which she should not escape. And yes, that's the same Tol in Galroth, the Isle of Werewolves, where Finrod met his fate, saving Beren. So, Dairon seeks to thwart our lovers yet again, to no avail. The last we hear of Dairon, he goes in search of Luthien, never to be seen again. But seeking for Luthien, in despair he wandered upon strange paths, and passing over the mountains he came into the east of Middle-earth, where for many ages he made lament beside dark waters for Luthien, daughter of Thingol, most beautiful of all living things. Interestingly, his end sounds a lot like Maglor's. Maglor, the second best musician in the First Age, is last seen wandering the shores of Middle-earth in lament. So that's Dairon. When it comes to Cyros, we actually get a quote from the Unfinished Tales in which Cyros talks to Dairon about the similarities between Beren and Turin. So he's answering Knapdragon's question for me. At this point, Turin, the human, is living in Doriath and is on good terms with King Thingol. Cyros, who is a member of the king's court, is of course jealous of the upstart human. For this quote, I should note that Turin is a somewhat distant relative of Beren. Nonetheless, he, Turin, was held in love and esteem by those who knew him well, and he had honor as the fosterling of the king. Yet there was one that begrudged him this, and ever the more as Turin drew nearer to manhood. Cyros, son of Ithilbor, was his name. He was of the Nandor, being one of those who took refuge in Doriath after the fall of their lord Denethor in the first battle of Beleriand. Cyros dwelt mostly in Menegroth, won the esteem of the king, and he was proud, dealing haughtily with those whom he deemed of lesser state and worth than himself. He became a friend of Dairon the minstrel, for he also was skilled in song, and he had no love for men, and least of all for any kinsman of Beren. "Is it not strange," said he, "that this land should be open to yet another of this unhappy race? Did not the other do harm enough in Doriath?" Therefore he looked askance on Turin and all that he did, saying what ill he could of it. But his words were cunning and his malice veiled. If he met with Turin alone, he spoke haughtily to him and showed plain his contempt. And Turin grew weary of him, though for long he returned ill words with silence. For Cyros was great among the people of Doriath and a counselor of the king. But the silence of Turin displeased Cyros as much as his words. So here we have our two elven jerks openly discussing their true feelings. And the reference contempt they feel comes down to Cyros's line. "Is it not strange that this land should be open to yet another of this unhappy race?" Among their other traits, they're also racists. And for Cyros, it all comes to a head when Turin, after being away for a few years, returns to Thingol's court. This is from the Silmarillion. "And when 3 years had passed, Turin returned again to Menegroth, and he came from the wild and was unkempt, and his gear and garments were wayworn. Now one there was in Doriath of the people of the Nandor, high in the councils of the king. Cyros was his name. He had long begrudged to Turin the honor he received as Thingol's foster son, and seated opposite to him at the board, he taunted him, saying, 'If the men of Hithlum are so wild and fell, of what sort are the women of that land? Do they run like deer, clad only in their hair?' Then Turin, in great anger, took up a drinking vessel and cast it at Cyros, and he was grievously hurt. On the next day, Cyros waylaid Turin as he set out from Menegroth to return to the marches. But Turin overcame him and set him to run naked as a hunted beast through the woods. Then Cyros, fleeing in terror before him, fell into the chasm of a stream, and his body was broken on a great rock in the water. But others coming saw what was done, and Mablung was among them, and he bade Turin return with him to Menegroth and abide the judgment of the king, seeking his pardon. But Turin, deeming himself now an outlaw, and fearing to be held captive, refused Mablung's bidding, and turned swiftly away. And passing through the girdle of Melian, he came into the woods west of Sirion. There he joined himself to a band of such houseless and desperate men as could be found in those evil days, lurking in the wild. And their hands were turned against all who came in their path, elves and men and orcs." I'm not sure that anyone is the good guy in that story, Cyros starts it, but Turin definitely ends it. But like Dairon's actions leading to Beren leaving the protection of Doriath, so we have that here. Turin feels forced to flee into the wilds, even though in his absence, Thingol pardoned him. So, as antagonistic forces for our heroes, Beren and Turin, our unlikable elves somewhat unwittingly give our heroes their call to action. But they're also reminders that the elves had their own issues. Jealousy, intolerance, vengefulness. They're the poster elves for how not to act. So I hope that answers your question, Napdragon. I really enjoyed researching these two. And that brings us to our last question for part 2. And this one comes from awesome commenter Annie68. And it's one word. Nerdanel. Love it. Before I launch into my chat about Feanor's wife, I thought I'd show the second gift that my wife gave me for our anniversary. Years ago, she gave me a copy of the Fellowship of the Ring screenplay signed by the cast. And this year, she gave me the Return of the King screenplay as well. What? You can see the signatures here. Let's see here. There's Billy Boyd. This down here is actually Sean Bean. So Boromir lives. You get a little Ian McKellen there. I mean, they're all up here. Here's Kate Blanchett. And you also get David Wenham. And what I love about his autograph is that he actually wrote his character name, Faramir, with it, which is like, oh, he's like, you probably didn't know this, but I'm the guy playing Faramir. Like, oh, no, David, we love you, man. You're awesome. Anyway, so an amazing gift. Now I just need the 2 towers to complete the set. All right, anyway, back to Nerdanel. First of all, admittedly, I remember her name because it has nerd in the title. She could start her own YouTube channel. But let's start with the passage in the Silmaril that establishes Nerdanel's marriage to Feanor. While still in his early youth, he wedded Nerdanel, the daughter of a great smith named Matan, among those of the Noldor most dear to Aule. And of Matan he learned much of the making of things in metal and in stone. Nerdanel also was firm of will, but more patient than Feanor, desiring to understand minds rather than to master them. And at first she restrained him when the fire of his heart grew too hot. But his later deeds grieved her, and they became estranged. 7 sons she bore to Feanor. Her mood she bequeathed in part to some of them, but not to all. So we learn from this that Nerdanel was the daughter of Matan, the master smith with red hair. And Matan taught his son-in-law, Feanor, much of his skill, an act he would later regret when Feanor started stockpiling weapons and armor. Bitterly did Matan rue the day that he taught to the husband of Nerdanel all the lore of metalwork that he had learned of Aule. We learn that Nerdanel is strong-willed but patient, desiring to understand minds rather than to master them. And we learn that her personality rubbed off on most of her sons, but not all. We'll talk about that more in a second. And perhaps most importantly, we learn that she was able to restrain Feanor's worst tendencies for a time, but eventually they became estranged. We get one more quote about that in the Silmarillion. And snared though he was, Feanor, in the webs of Melkor's malice against the Valar, he held no converse with him, and took no counsel from him. For Feanor was driven by the fire of his own heart only, working ever swiftly and alone. And he asked the aid and sought the counsel of none that dwelt in Aman, great or small, save only, and for a little while, of Nerdanel the Wise, his wife. Nerdanel the Wise. It's a good title to have. And if we're just sourcing the Silmarillion, that would be about it for Nerdanel. But luckily, there's the history of Middle-earth, specifically the Shibboleth of Feanor and Morgoth's Ring. And we learn a lot more about Nerdanel, including a Shakespearean-level tragic twist on the Oath of Feanor storyline. It's not canon, but Tolkien fleshed it out so much it must have been very close to making the final cut. And it's a doozy. But first, let's get the extra background material that we've learned from these books. we learn this interesting fact about Nerdanel. In her youth, she loved to wander far from the dwellings of the Noldor, either beside the long shores of the sea or in the hills. And thus, she and Feanor had met, and were companions in many journeys. So she shares that same explorer's spirit with Feanor. It's probably one of the traits that brought them together. And it also means that when the time came to journey east to Middle-earth, she didn't stay behind because she feared the journey. She stayed behind because she disagreed with her husband's actions. And we get this awesome glimpse into her own crafting excellence, no doubt at least partially inspired by her father. Nerdanel learned much of crafts that women of the Noldor seldom used, the making of things of metal and stone. She made images, some of the Valar in their forms visible, and many others of men and women of the Eldar. And these were so like that their friends, if they knew not her art, would speak to them. But many things she wrought also of her own thought, in shapes strong and strange, but beautiful. So she was a master sculptor and artist. I like that she made images so lifelike that elves would try to talk to them. It's almost like she had her own Tusso's wax museum. We also learn about which of her children inherited her father's hair color. His hair, Matan's, was not as dark or black and was that of most of the Noldor, but brown and had glints of coppery red in it. Of Nerdanel's 7 children, the oldest, and the twins, a very rare thing among the Eldar, had hair of this kind. The eldest also wore a copper circlet. So the eldest son of Nerdanel is obviously our red-haired Maedhros. But according to this, the youngest sons, the twins we come to know as Amrod and Amras, also had red hair. And very interestingly, we get this line. All the sons, save Curufin, preferred their mother names, and were ever afterwards remembered by them. So elves have a father name and a mother name, and they can choose which name they prefer to go by. In the case of Feanor, he went by his mother name, Feanaro, Spirit of Fire. But his half-brothers, Fingolfin and Finarfin, went by their father names. 6 of Feanor's sons chose to go by their mother names, which I think shows a stronger affinity for their mother, Nerdanel. Curufin is the one son that chooses his father name, Curafinwe, skillful Finwë. That name, Curafinwe, was Feanor's father name, the name he chose not to go by. But he saw the most of himself in Curufin, in look and in temperament, and so he gave that son his own name. And of course, Curufin was the only son of Feanor to have a son. That son ended up being Celebrimbor, who tried very hard to live up to the crafting legacy of his grandfather, making the 3 elven rings in the process. A final note on that, Nerdanel must have seen how similar Curufin was to Feanor, because her mother name for him was Atarinke, Little Father. So now we come to the unfortunately non-canonical, but nonetheless uber-dramatic Oath of Feanor subplot. The story starts actually with the naming of the sons. This is from the Shibboleth of Feanor. You'll notice that instead of Amrod and Amras, Tolkien is using different names for the twins. The 2 twins were both red-haired. Nerdanel gave them both the name Ambarusa, for they were much alike and remained so while they lived. When Feanor begged that their names should at least be different, Nerdanel looked strange, and after a while said, "Then let one be called Umbarto, but which, time will decide." Feanor was disturbed by this ominous name, Umbarto means the fated, and changed it to Ambarto. But Nerdanel said, "Umbarto I spoke, yet do as you wish. It will make no difference." Okay, so I'm sensing some tension between the couple already. These are sons 6 and 7, so they're well into their relationship. She wants to give the twins the same name. He insists that she give them different names, so she says, fine. One of them will be called the Fated, but time will figure out which one that is. Like, oh boy. In any fairy tale or myth, you never want to be someone called the Fated. And we're seeing that Nerdanel may indeed have some gift of prophecy. And now we get the rest of the story, beginning with a really emotionally charged argument between Nerdanel and Feanor. Later, as Feanor became more and more fell and violent and rebelled against the Valar, Nerdanel, after long endeavoring to change his mood, became estranged. Her kin were devoted to Aule, who counseled her father to take no part in the rebellion. It will in the end only lead Feanor and all of your children to death. She retired to her father's house, but when it became clear that Feanor and his sons would leave Valinor forever, she came to him before the host started on its northward march and begged that Feanor should leave her the two youngest, the twins, or one at least of them. He replied, "Were you a true wife, as you had been till cozened by Aule, you would keep all of them, for you would come with us. If you desert me, you desert also all of your children, for they are determined to go with their father." Then Nerdanel was angry, and she answered, "You will not keep all of them. One at least will never set foot on Middle-earth. Take your evil omens to the Valar, who will delight in them," said Feanor. "I defy them." So they parted. Now it is told how Feanor stole the ships of the Teleri, and breaking faith with Fingolfin, and with those faithful to him, sailed away in them to Middle-earth. The ships were anchored off the shore, and all the host of Feanor went on land and camped there. In the night, Feanor, filled with malice, aroused Curufin, and with him, and a few of those most close to Feanor in obedience, he went to the ships and set them all aflame. And the dark sky was red as with a terrible dawn. All the camp was roused, and Feanor returning said, "Now at least I am certain that no faint heart or traitor among you will be able to take back even one ship to the succor of Fingolfin and his folk." But all save few were dismayed, because there were many things still on board that they had not yet brought ashore, and the ships would have been useful for further journeying. They were still far north and had purposed to sail southward to some better haven. In the morning the host was mustered, but of Feanor's 7 sons, only 6 were to be found. Then Ambarusa went pale with fear. "Did you not then rouse Ambarusa, my brother, whom you called Ambarto?" he said. "He would not come ashore to sleep," he said, "in discomfort." But it is thought, and no doubt Feanor guessed this also, that it was in the mind of Ambarto to sail his ship back and rejoin Nerdanel, for he had been much shocked by the deed of his father. "That ship I destroyed first," said Feanor, hiding his own dismay. "Then rightly you gave the name to the youngest of your children," said Ambarusa, "and Umbarto, the Fated, was its true form. Fell and fey are you become." And after that, no one dared speak again to Feanor of this matter. What? I was stunned when I first read this passage. So Feanor's youngest son, whom his mother named Umbarto the Fated, is disgusted by his father's actions, the kinslaying, stealing the ships, leaving Fingolfin behind. So he endeavors to stay in one of the ships, pick his moment, then sail back to his mother. And when Feanor sets the ships on fire, he kills his son. And the surviving twin has obviously lost all respect for his father. In the Silmarillion, the twins died during the 3rd kinslaying. But here, just as Nerdanel prophesied, one of her sons never set foot on Middle-earth. That is dark. And it shows how broken that entire family became. Having lost her husband and 7 children, I'm guessing Nerdanel lived a life of sorrow and regret. I hope she returned to her art for solace. But there you go. I hope that answered your question, Annie. And that does it for Mini Topics Part 2. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!